Welcome to WW2 Heroic Tales, where true stories of courage, sacrifice, and extraordinary heroism come alive from the darkest days of World War II. Join us as we uncover the untold moments that shaped history. The year is 1942. The Battle of the Atlantic rages, a brutal, unforgiving war of attrition that Winston Churchill called the dominating factor above all others. For 3 years, German U-boats, the infamous Wolf Packs, have prowled these dark waters, their mission simple and savage: to strangle Great Britain into submission by sinking the merchant vessels that are its lifeline. This is the tonnage war, a grim calculus where victory is measured in the cold, hard numbers of sunken steel and drowned men. Under the command of Gross-Admiral Karl Dönitz, the U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine operates with ruthless efficiency. Their doctrine is clear: sink, destroy, and move on. There is no room for sentiment, no quarter given in the vast, lonely expanse of the ocean. The U-boat is a predator, its crew a tightly knit brotherhood conditioned to the claustrophobic, diesel-choked confines of their steel coffins. Their world is one of sonar pings, depth charge explosions, and the silent, terrifying hunt for shadows beneath the waves. The hunters themselves are targets, with Allied anti-submarine warfare growing more sophisticated by the month. Life expectancy for a U-boat crewman is brutally short. In this theater of war, the enemy is not just the destroyers and corvettes of the Royal Navy, but the ocean itself, a cold, indifferent force that claims victor and vanquished alike. The rules of engagement have hardened. Early in the war, some U-boat commanders might have offered assistance to the crews of ships they had sunk, but such instances have become vanishingly rare. The war has become total, and the sea a lawless battlefield where survival is paramount and chivalry is a forgotten luxury. It is in this merciless environment that our story begins, in the South Atlantic, far from the main convoy routes, a supposedly quieter sector where a lone U-boat seeks its prey, operating under the unforgiving doctrines of total war. At the heart of our story is Captain Werner Hartenstein, the 34-year-old commander of UMNS 156. Hartenstein was the embodiment of the professional German naval officer. A seasoned veteran, he had joined the Reichsmarine in 1928, long before the rise of the Nazi Party, and had served on torpedo boats before transferring to the U-boat force in 1941. He was not a political ideologue but a dedicated and highly competent seaman, respected by his crew for his calm demeanor and exceptional skill. By September 1942, he was an ace, a recipient of the prestigious Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for his successes in sinking over 100,000 tons of Allied shipping. He commanded UMNS 156, a Type IXC U-boat, one of the formidable long-range workhorses of the German submarine fleet. Displacing over 1,100 tons, these vessels were designed for extended patrols deep into enemy territory. With a range of over 13,000 nautical miles, UMNS 156 could strike as far as the Caribbean or the coast of West Africa. It was armed with 22 torpedoes, launched from 6 tubes, 4 at the bow and 2 at the stern. For surface engagements, it carried a powerful 10.5 cm SKC/32 naval gun on its deck, a weapon capable of finishing off crippled merchants or engaging smaller armed vessels. Inside, the 48-man crew lived in cramped, perpetually damp conditions, the air thick with the smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and cooking. They were a close-knit family, their lives and survival dependent on the skill of their commander and the integrity of their steel hull. For them, Hartenstein was more than a captain. He was the ultimate authority, the man whose judgment stood between them and a watery grave. His orders were absolute, his experience their greatest asset. On this patrol, his fifth, Hartenstein was operating alone off the coast of West Africa, hunting for high-value independent targets, far from the heavily defended convoy lanes of the North Atlantic. He was a predator in his element, a master of his deadly craft, operating under the strict directives of Admiral Dönitz. Every instinct, every ounce of his training was focused on one goal: finding and sinking enemy ships. In the crosshairs of Humanist 156 sailed the RMS Laconia. She was a ghost of a more glamorous era. Launched in 1921 for the Cunard Line, she had spent 2 decades as a luxurious ocean liner, ferrying wealthy passengers across the Atlantic and on world cruises. With her elegant lounges and spacious decks, she represented an age of peace and civility. But war had transformed her. Requisitioned by the Admiralty in 1939, her fine interiors were stripped out, her hull painted a drab wartime gray, and her decks fitted with anti-aircraft guns and a single 6-inch naval gun. She was now an armed troopship, a vital cog in the Allied war machine. Yet, her passenger list for this final voyage was a complex microcosm of the global conflict. On board were 2732 souls. This included 463 officers and crew, 80 civilians, primarily women and children, families of the military personnel, 286 British Army soldiers, 103 Polish soldiers from the Carpathian Brigade who served as guards, and crucially, 1793 Italian prisoners of war captured during the North African campaign. This mixture of combatants, civilians, guards, and prisoners created a volatile and crowded environment. The Italian POWs were held deep within the cargo holds, a ship within a ship, their fate entirely in the hands of their British and Polish captors. The Laconia had departed from Suez, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and was now making her way north through the Atlantic, bound for the United Kingdom. She was sailing alone, without a naval escort, a common practice for faster vessels deemed capable of outrunning a submerged U-boat. But on the surface, a Type IXC submarine like Humanist 156 could nearly match her top speed. Her lone, zigzagging course in the vastness of the ocean was her primary defense. For the thousands on board, the voyage was a tedious affair, a long journey home after years in the desert. The threat of U-boats was a distant, abstract fear. The tropical sun and calm seas gave a false sense of security, belying the mortal danger that lurked just beneath the waves, waiting for a single mistake, a single moment of detection. On the evening of September 12, 1942, The tropical sky was dark and moonless. The South Atlantic was calm, the sea swelling gently under a canopy of stars. Aboard UMS 156, the routine of the hunt was underway. The watch officer on the bridge scanned the horizon with powerful Zeiss binoculars. At 8:07 p.m., a silhouette was spotted, a large, dark shape moving steadily against the horizon. Hartenstein was summoned to the bridge. Through the periscope in the conning tower, he examined the target. It was a large ship, traveling alone and zigzagging, indicating it was an enemy vessel aware of the submarine threat. It appeared to be a troop transport, a high-value military target. From his perspective, this was a legitimate and important kill. Following standard procedure, he began to shadow the vessel, maneuvering UMS 156 into a favorable attack position ahead of the target's path. The atmosphere inside the U-boat was tense and focused. The crew moved with quiet, practiced efficiency. Orders were given in low tones. At the torpedo rooms, the launch tubes were flooded, the outer doors opened. Hartenstein calculated the ship's speed, course, and range. For 2 hours, the deadly cat-and-mouse game continued. At 10 p.m., UMS 156 was perfectly positioned on the Laconia's starboard bow. The command was given: rower Eins Los, tube 1 fire. A G-7E electric torpedo slid silently from the submarine, its batteries powering it on a direct course. A few moments later, a second torpedo followed. Inside UMS 156, the crew counted the seconds, listening intently on the hydrophones. At 10:22 p.m., a dull thud echoed through the hull, followed by a much larger explosion. The first torpedo had struck the Laconia's number 2 hold. The second hit moments later, crippling the engine room. For Hartenstein and his crew, it was a successful attack. Another 19,695 tons of enemy shipping would be added to their tally. Their mission, as they understood it, was complete. They prepared to surface to confirm the kill and depart the area before any Allied warships could be summoned. It was, by all measures, a routine sinking in the brutal logic of the Battle of the Atlantic. As the Laconia listed heavily, sending cascades of seawater across her decks, chaos erupted. The torpedo hits had plunged most of the ship into darkness and knocked out communications. Lifeboats were launched in a frenzy, some crashing into the sea, others capsizing from overcrowding. Below decks, the situation was catastrophic, especially for the Italian prisoners. The first torpedo had hit their hold directly, and many were killed instantly. The survivors found their escape routes blocked by locked hatches and rising water, their Polish guards initially refusing to release them. But as the ship began its final plunge, a British officer ordered the Italians freed. They scrambled onto the decks, adding to the sheer pandemonium. Less than an hour after the torpedoes struck, the Laconia slipped beneath the waves. Now over 2,000 people were adrift in the dark, oily water, clinging to debris and overcrowded lifeboats. Aboard UMS 156, Hartenstein surfaced his submarine a safe distance away. Standard procedure was to observe the sinking, identify the ship if possible for the war diary, and then leave the area quickly. As the U-boat's deck cleared the water, the crew on the bridge were met not with silence, but with a sound that chilled them to the bone, the collective sound of thousands of human voices crying for help, screaming in terror and pain across the water. Hartenstein maneuvered UMS 156 closer to the field of debris and lifeboats, hoping to capture the ship's senior officers for intelligence. It was then that his lookouts made a startling discovery. As they approached a lifeboat, they heard the survivors shouting not in English but in Italian. "Aiuto, Italiani! Help! We are Italians!" The shocking truth dawned on Hartenstein and his crew. They had sunk a ship carrying nearly 18,000 of their own allies. The grim calculus of the tonnage war was suddenly replaced by a horrific human reality. These were not just enemy soldiers. They were comrades, along with hundreds of women and children, now fighting for their lives in the shark-infested waters of the Atlantic. The routine sinking had transformed into a human catastrophe of unimaginable scale, and Werner Hartenstein was at its epicenter. On the conning tower of UMS 156, surrounded by the desperate cries of the dying, Werner Hartenstein faced a choice that would define his life and legacy. The rules of war, the direct orders from U-boat command, and the instinct for self-preservation all dictated one course of action: submerge and leave. To remain on the surface was to invite destruction. The Laconia's distress signals would already be broadcasting across the Allied networks, and patrol aircraft or enemy warships could arrive at any moment. His submarine was a war machine, not a rescue vessel. It was dangerously overcrowded with its own crew. Taking on hundreds of survivors was tactically insane. It would consume precious fuel, foul the cramped interior, and make the boat dangerously slow to dive. Yet Hartenstein looked out at the sea of suffering and saw not enemy combatants or Allied prisoners, but human beings. The presence of Italian allies and, as he would soon discover, women and children weighed heavily on his conscience. In a decision that stunned his own crew, he chose humanity over doctrine. He gave the order to commence a rescue operation. The crew of UMS 156, trained for ruthless aggression, now began the painstaking and perilous work of saving lives. They pulled traumatized, oil-soaked survivors from the water, dragging them onto the narrow deck of the submarine. The small vessel was quickly overwhelmed. Over 200 survivors were crowded onto the U-boat's hull and packed into its interior, filling every available space. The officers gave up their bunks, and the crew shared their meager rations and fresh water. The U-boat's sick bay was overflowing with the injured. Hartenstein directed his men to gather as many lifeboats as possible, tying them together with tow lines to UMS 156. He organized the survivors, attempting to separate the nationalities and tend to the most grievously wounded. The submarine, a symbol of stealth and death, was transformed into a floating island of refuge, its sleek gray hull a beacon of hope in the immense darkness of the Atlantic. It was an act of profound compassion, a direct contradiction to the brutal nature of his mission, and a dangerous defiance of the unwritten laws of submarine warfare. As the scale of the disaster became horrifyingly clear, Hartenstein knew his submarine alone could not possibly save everyone. Hundreds were still in the water, and the lifeboats he had tethered were dangerously overloaded. He was responsible for a flotilla of the damned, and his own vessel was a vulnerable, stationary target. In this desperate situation, he made another decision, one even more audacious and dangerous than the first. He decided to break radio silence and broadcast his intentions to the world, including his enemies. At 6 a.m. on September 13th, Hartenstein ordered his radio operator to transmit an uncoded message in English on the international 25-meter band. The message was clear and unprecedented. It read, "If any ship will assist the shipwrecked Laconia crew, I will not attack her, provided I am not being attacked by ship or air force. I have picked up 193 men, 453 south, 1126 west, German submarine." This was an astonishing act. He was openly giving away his precise location, declaring a unilateral truce, and inviting his enemies to join a humanitarian effort. He was effectively turning himself into a sitting duck, trusting in the shared code of mariners, the unwritten law of the sea that dictates aid to those in peril. To further signal his peaceful intent, Hartenstein ordered a large, makeshift Red Cross flag to be fashioned from a white sheet and red paint. This flag, measuring approximately 2 square meters, was draped conspicuously over his deck gun. His submarine, now a floating refugee camp flying a flag of neutrality, sat motionless in the middle of the Atlantic, a blatant violation of every principle of stealth warfare. He also radioed U-boat command, informing Admiral Dönitz of the situation and the presence of Italian allies. Dönitz was caught in a dilemma. The action was contrary to all standing orders, yet he could not be seen to abandon his Axis partners. His response was a mix of fury and reluctant acceptance, a conflict between military necessity and political reality. While Hartenstein awaited a response, he continued the rescue, his U-boat a fragile sanctuary under a flag of mercy, utterly exposed and vulnerable. Hartenstein's extraordinary broadcast did not go unanswered. At U-boat command, Admiral Dönitz, after his initial shock, made a calculated decision. He ordered 2 other U-boats operating in the vicinity, UMNS 506 commanded by Captain Lieutenant Erich Wuedemann, and UMNS 507 under Korvettenkapitän Haro Schacht, to race to Hartenstein's position and assist in the rescue. He also contacted the naval command of Germany's Axis partner, Italy, who dispatched their own long-range submarine, the Comandante Capellini. Furthermore, Dönitz's staff messaged the Vichy French government, formally neutral but collaborating with Germany, requesting surface ships to sail from Dakar in West Africa. What followed was one of the most surreal episodes of the Second World War. A multinational, Axis-led humanitarian mission took shape in the middle of an active war zone. For several days, the waters where the Laconia went down became a scene of bizarre cooperation. UMNS 506 and UMNS 507 arrived and immediately began taking on survivors. Like UMNS 156, their decks and interiors were soon crammed with British, Polish and Italian men, women, and children. The German submariners, who days before had been hunting Allied ships, were now sharing their food, water, and medical supplies with their former enemies. The sight was incredible. 3 German U-boats, their hulls low in the water under the weight of hundreds of rescued people, clustered together, towing strings of lifeboats under the hot African sun. They were joined by the Italian submarine, adding to the strange flotilla of mercy. Aboard the submarines, an uneasy truce held. British officers shared cramped quarters with German captains. A British doctor worked alongside the German medical orderly to treat the wounded, regardless of their nationality. The German crews, for their part, acted with professionalism and compassion, doing their best to manage the impossible situation. Meanwhile, from French West Africa, the cruiser Gloire and 2 other smaller vessels steamed towards the location. For a fleeting moment, a small patch of the Atlantic Ocean became a sanctuary, where the enmities of the war were suspended in the face of a shared human tragedy. It was a testament to the common decency of the sailors involved, a fragile alliance forged in the crucible of disaster. The fragile truce was about to be shattered. On the morning of September 16th, 4 days into the rescue operation, a new shape appeared in the sky. It was an American B-24 Liberator bomber, flying from a secret airbase on Ascension Island, a tiny volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic. The pilot, Lieutenant James D. Harden, was on a routine anti-submarine patrol. As he approached, he was met with an unbelievable sight. A German U-boat on the surface, flying a Red Cross flag, with hundreds of people crowded on its deck and towing lifeboats filled with more survivors. Harden circled the scene, baffled. The submarine, UMNS 156, even signaled him with a Morse lamp, asking for assistance. The British RAF officer being sheltered in Hartenstein's conning tower sent his own message. RAF officer speaking from German submarine. Laconia survivors on board, soldiers, civilians, women, children. Unsure of how to proceed, Lieutenant Harden radioed his base for instructions, accurately describing the situation, including the presence of the Red Cross flag and the survivors. On Ascension Island, the message was received by the duty commander, Captain Robert C. Richardson, III. Richardson was operating under a strict standing order. All German U-boats were to be considered hostile and attacked on sight. He was reportedly unaware of the scale of the Laconia sinking and was deeply suspicious. He viewed the situation not as a humanitarian crisis, but as a potential German trap or a ruse to repair a damaged submarine. His decision was swift and uncompromising. According to records, he believed the U-boat posed a threat to Allied shipping and the secret airfield. He sent back a blunt, unambiguous order to Lieutenant Harden: sink sub. Harden, though reportedly conflicted, was a soldier under orders. He made several bombing runs on UMNS 156. The first bombs fell wide, but on a later pass, 2 bombs straddled the submarine. One landed among the lifeboats being towed, killing dozens of survivors instantly. Another struck the U-boat itself, causing minor damage. On the bridge of UMNS 156, Hartenstein watched in horror and disbelief. His act of mercy had been met with lethal force. His broadcast, his Red Cross flag, it had all meant nothing. With his submarine damaged and under attack, he had no choice. He ordered the survivors on his deck into the water, cut the tow lines to the remaining lifeboats, and gave the command that tore at his soul. Alarm, Tauchen. Alarm, dive. The attack by the B-24 Liberator brought the rescue to a brutal and tragic end. U-156, though damaged, managed to escape beneath the waves, forced to abandon the very people it had saved. The other U-boats in the area, U-506 and U-507, were also targeted by aircraft and forced to dive, casting off their own complements of survivors. The brief, surreal moment of humanitarian cooperation was over. Of the 2732 people aboard the Laconia, only 1,113 ultimately survived. Over 16,000 perished, many of them dying in the aftermath of the B-24 attack. The survivors were eventually picked up by the Vichy French ships that arrived days later. The incident sent shockwaves through the Kriegsmarine. An enraged Admiral Dönitz saw the American attack as the ultimate betrayal of the unwritten laws of the sea. He believed his commander's good faith had been met with deadly force, proving that any attempt at rescue was a fatal liability. On September 17th, he issued War Order No. 154, which became known as the Triton Null, or more famously, the Laconia Order. Its text was stark and chilling. It forbade any U-boat from attempting to rescue the crews of sunken ships. It stated, "Rescue contradicts the most basic demands of warfare for the destruction of hostile ships and their crews." It concluded with the words, "Be harsh. Remember that the enemy has no regard for women and children when he bombs German cities." This order marked a point of no return. The brutal logic of total war had triumphed over the last vestiges of maritime chivalry. For the remainder of the war, U-boat crews were under strict orders to surface, confirm a kill, and leave the survivors to their fate. After the war, this very order would be used as evidence against Admiral Dönitz at the Nuremberg trials, where he was charged with war crimes. He was ultimately convicted, though his sentence was lighter than others, partly because Allied admirals testified that they had issued similar no-rescue policies. As for Werner Hartenstein, he did not survive the war. 6 months after the Laconia incident, on March 8, 1943, U-156 was sunk with all hands by a U.S. Navy Catalina flying boat east of Barbados. The man who chose humanity over orders died in the service of the very war machine that punished his compassion. His story remains a powerful, tragic testament to an individual's conscience in a time of institutionalized brutality. Thank you for joining WW2 Heroic Tales. Through the stories of brave souls from World War II, we honor their memory and keep their legacy alive for history and generations to come.